Good evening, and welcome to this second lecture in the series. Since we are exploring initially the origins of Indian civilization, we cannot avoid a famous, perennial, I should say, controversy, which is the Aryan controversy. This is a recurring question mark put by students and adults alike, and it is also a major question which has repercussions in many fields. You will understand in a few minutes what I mean by that. It determines, in a way, the origin of Indian civilization, since the Aryan invasion or migration theory assumes or holds that Aryans came from outside India. I'll give the details very shortly, and basically imported the fundamentals of Indian civilization. That is to say, they imported, they brought with them Sanskrit language, they brought the Vedas, they brought a certain social order which was based on the caste system. And these things in many ways are important ingredients of the later classical Indian civilization that we will see in the next lecture, the Ganges civilization, which began in the first millennium BC, which culminated, for instance, in the Mauryan Empire and so on. So it is an important question because it boils down to whether those important ingredients of Indian civilization are indigenous or not. But then it also puts the question of what is the relationship between this classical Ganges civilization starting first millennium BC and the Indus civilization which we saw the other day, which flourished in the third millennium BC. Is there no connection at all, or do we find still some legacy lingering on? So to start with, I chose a evocative picture from a textbook used in some schools in Tamil Nadu. In fact, in my city of Coimbatore, this is where I picked it up one day accidentally. And you see a very, you see in fact the Aryans sacking a Harappan city and slaughtering the hapless Harappans mercilessly and destroying therefore the Indus civilization. So this, Hollywoodian scenario, or maybe Bollywoodian if you prefer, I don't know, is what our children still learn at school. It depends a little bit. NCERT textbooks have softened the whole. They still go by the Aryan Invasion Theory, but in a much more discreet manner. But in this kind of textbooks, and especially in the South, where, as you might know, the Aryan Invasion Theory is a kind of essential dogma, because without it, the so-called Dravidian parties would have no ideology left. Not that they have much left anyway, but this is what students learn, and in this case, in class 4. And you have another picture on the left, which shows the Aryans, riding across perhaps Central Asia before they reach finally the Indian subcontinent. So what the students learn, and you have to imagine the psychology of a child of class 4, is that the earliest inhabitants of India were the Dravidians. That's already quite a tall order. And please note that the word Dravidian is not defined. We're not told what is a Dravidian, who is a Dravidian. Who were the people who lived in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa? Second very tall claim. The Aryans migrated from Central Asia and drove away the Dravidians after fierce battles. That's a third tall claim. The culture of the Aryans was entirely different from that of the Dravidians. So within a very short paragraph, which of course students have to learn by heart, please remember, an imprint is created, and naturally, a Tamilian child will be immediately building up some resentment against those wicked Aryans who slaughtered their ancestors. So this is the kind of picture we still have today in India. Now, more seriously, what does the theory consist in? We have, therefore, the notion of a new people speaking an early form of Sanskrit. You know, Vedas are not in classical Sanskrit, they are in Vedic Sanskrit. It's an archaic form. They're supposed to have entered India about the middle of the second millennium BC, and either brutally conquered or in softer versions today, somehow dominated local populations to the extent that they could spread their language, their Vedic culture, and their caste-based social order. So this is the essence of the theory as it stands. So we have two versions, the hard one, which is that they destroyed the Indus cities, and this is still taught in many textbooks, and a softer one, which is that since they came in 1500 BC, and I told you the other day that the Indus civilization collapses at least in its state structure, in its urban order, by 1900 BC, there is a gap. And therefore, the new proponents of the Aryan Migration Theory, as it is now called, say that, well, they entered, and somehow they still subjugated the local populations, whoever they were, and spread their culture, etc. So, and then we have the fact that the Rig Veda does speak of battles between the Aryas. Aryas, will have to define what an Arya is. In fact, let me say it straight away. In the Veda, the Arya is very clearly somebody who fights for a cosmic order called Ritam, by the side of the gods and the rishis. This is the Arya. The Arya is one who observes properly the rituals, pronounces the mantras correctly, and fights for that cosmic order. This is the definition. In fact, there is no notion of an Aryan people. It doesn't exist in the Vedas. When the Rig Veda starts talking about peoples, it speaks of Panchajana, 5 peoples. And they have other names. They are the Bharatas, the Purus, the Kurus, the Druyus, and the Anus, if I remember correctly. So there is never a notion that Aryas constitute a population in the Rig Veda. But they have adversaries. They are the Dasyus or Dasas, which I will return to. And if you read the usual history textbooks, you are told that those were dark-skinned and stub-nosed, and therefore they were very good candidates to be portrayed as, you know, original tribes or Dravidians or whatever. This is what it boils down to. Now, how do we approach such a problem in an intelligent way? And many scholars have debated it since something like 1820, 1830. This is where this whole discussion begins. And we have many approaches. One is, of course, literary. We have to look into the texts. That alone is a huge exercise, but I'll just show a few highlights. Geographical, we have some important clues in the Rig Veda. Archaeological, of course, we'll have to see whether we have traces of this invasion, actual manifestations of it, because if after all an entire people entered India and crossed the whole northwest of India to penetrate the Gangetic plains, you would expect that there are some archaeological left. They are supposed to have brought a different culture, so this leaves physical traces. Then anthropological and genetic, we're told it's a different people, right? So can we detect if perhaps with different physical types in the skeletal remains, or genetic studies pointing to a sudden change in the gene pool, etc. So this is an important, especially in the last 30 years, important new field of research. Cultural, because we are told, as the textbook says, that Aryans had a totally different culture from that of the supposed original inhabitants. So can we detect any radical change in the culture of the north of the subcontinent? Now 6, I will not be able to deal with this today because it becomes too vast. There's a lot of very interesting astronomical evidence in Vedic texts and late Vedic texts which does give dates, which curiously are almost all of them located in the 3rd, 4th, and even beyond a millennium BC. And this is something which scholars who defend the Aryan invasion or migration theory usually do not deal with, because it's very embarrassing to, for example, I may just mention briefly one example, the Shatapatha Brahmana, which is a commentary on one of the Vedas, mentions that when you build the fire altars, you should face the east. You know, the priest sits facing the east. I will come back to this point later on today. And how do you determine the east? Well, you choose the point where the Kritika, that is to say the Pleiades star cluster, is rising, because Kritika never swerves from the east. And this is something which happened for a large part of the year in sometime between 2400 and 3100 BC, not afterwards, because of the precession of the equinoxes. So we have certain dates like that which keep recurring, and this would require a whole treatment of itself. There are many dates, but none of them are compatible with an invasion taking place in 1500 BC. They are much older. Finally, linguistic. Now, linguistic again is a vast field, and it's a very technical field. In fact, I'm not very competent in it, but I have studied whatever I could as a layman. And what I have seen is that the Aryan invasion theory originally has two raisons d'être, two purposes. One is that the scholars right from the late 18th century, William Jones, needed to explain the newly discovered connection between Sanskrit and the European languages like Greek and Latin. That connection is obvious, it is absolutely non-controversial, and this is what actually gave the name to the Indo-European family of languages, which includes all North Indian languages, except a few tribal ones, and Iranian, Persian, and languages like Afghani, and all European languages basically, except a few like Basque and so on. Now, this requires an explanation. How come this huge region has a single family of languages? The easy explanation was, of course, to imagine a population somewhere in the center of gravity of that region, which could be, the Black Sea, which could be southern Russia, which could be Central Asia, and imagining this population to radiate in all directions, which is what was done. But then there is a simplification here, which is that we have to imagine, to accept the so-called tree model of linguistics, where we imagine a common root and all languages nicely branching out of this common root. And this model has been increasingly disputed, rather complexified, because it's not as if languages simply emerge from a common root. They also keep interacting laterally. And lateral interactions are equally important and end up creating convergences, divergences. For example, in India, South Indian languages, so-called Dravidian languages, are definitely from a different family. They are not Indo-European languages. Nevertheless, there's been interaction for so many, centuries or millennia, whatever, that in fact they have tended to converge. And if this process continues, one day, for a modern observer who doesn't know past linguistics, he may find that South Indian and North Indian languages belong to a single family. It is possible. This has happened in the past. So this has led a number of linguists to finally agree that the Indo-European family of languages can have different kinds of explanations. And it can be migrations, but it need not also be migrations. An increasing number of linguists prefer mechanisms of interaction where populations do not actually move, but keep being in contact. So this field is complex. I will only say that even though mainstream conventional linguists still prefer the Aryan invasion or migration model. Some others do not, and they acknowledge that the question remains open from their point of view. So we have to start with I'll select only the first 5 fields, and that too I can cover only briefly. First, the literary evidence. And the main thing which scholars immediately noted is that if Aryans had come into India and then they settled on the banks of the Indus or its tributaries or the Saraswati, because Saraswati, as we will see, is very frequently mentioned in the Rig Veda, you would expect them to carry with them memories of their homeland, of their long travel through Central Asia at least, and then the crossing of the Afghan passes and so on. These would have been something which would have remained important culturally in the memory of that people. There is absolutely no such trace. Despite valiant efforts by many scholars, the Rig Veda is absolutely silent about any land outside India. In fact, its territory, its geography, as we will see, is basically northwest of the Indian subcontinent. So this is embarrassing. And Sri Aurobindo in 1915, even before him, Swami Vivekananda had already made similar statements. He said, there is actually no mention of such an invasion. There is no reliable indication of any racial difference between so-called Aryans and the Dasyus, who are supposed to be the original inhabitants subjugated by the Aryans. Even modern scholars, George Dorsey, who is both an Indologist and archaeologist from Canada, recently wrote, even apparently clear indications of historical struggles between dark aborigines in the Rig Veda and Arya conquerors turn out to be misleading. So we have to be very cautious with the text. In fact, typical example is, how do we conclude that the Dasyus are dark-skinned? They're not dark-skinned. The Rig Veda never says that they are dark-skinned. It says that they are wrapped in darkness. They are wrapped in a thick envelope or cover of darkness. Now, this is something which is not the same as being dark-skinned. And in many mythologies of the world, when you have a battle in Greek mythology, for example, between forces of light or good and forces of evil or darkness, you will represent the demons, whoever they are, as basically dark. Even in popular Amarchitra Kathas, when an Asura is depicted, he is depicted as being dark-skinned. It doesn't mean that he belongs to a different race. It simply means that there is, something dark about him. So we have to be careful not to use figurative or metaphorical language on a very literary footing and to, try to deduct biological facts from what is essentially a metaphor. Stubb knows the same thing. There is one passage in the Rig Veda, and only one, which is that the Dasyus are depicted as Anasa. Now, Max Muller translated Anasa as Anasa, which therefore would be noseless, and all scholars after him started saying that, well, the Dasyus are noseless and therefore they are Dravidians, as if South Indians had no nose worth the name. But somehow this was the impression, and this is just because of one single occurrence in 1024 hymns. In fact, the traditional interpretation of Anasa in India by Sayana, the Vedic commentator of the 15th century, had been not Anasa but Anasa, which means mouthless. And the Veda constantly insists on this notion that those who really are the Aryas are those who pronounce correctly the mantras. If you cannot pronounce the Vedic mantras correctly, they have no efficacy. So mouthless means, and this is made clear by other passages, those who actually cannot pronounce, or those who sometimes corrupt the mantras, the Vedic speech. So this is what it means, and not noses. You can see how easy it is to slip into predetermined interpretations. And the second remarkable point of the literary evidence is that, what about those Dravidians? They're supposed to have been either slaughtered or driven to South India. And we do have in Tamil an ancient literature called the Sangam literature, which the earliest layers of which go back to possibly 200, 300 BC at the most. And well, there are many traditions, legends, stories which are part of it. And the striking thing is that there is not one of them which refers ever to this grand scenario of, having been driven away from their cities and hunted all the way to South India. There is absolutely no such memory of a clash, whether physical, cultural, religious, or any. The only clash with the Arya kings, as the Sangam literature calls them, meaning North Indian kings, are of a military nature, where many Tamil kings boast of having gone to North India and conquered this king, that king, brought back waters from Ganga and stones from the Himalayas and such things. So this has nothing to do with the Aryan Invasion Theory. And in fact, the Sangam literature is highly respectful of the Vedas. It considers that the Brahmanas who sing the Vedic hymns are to be revered, to be respected. All the rituals depicted are basically Vedic rituals. If you see the wedding of Kannagi and Kovalan in the Shilapadikaram, they walk around a fire altar 7 times, and so on and so forth. So there is plenty of evidence to show that we have neither memory of such an event, but also no cultural clash. Now let me go to the, sorry, doesn't matter. Geographic evidence. First of all, and surprisingly, there are lots of references in the Rig Veda to the ocean. And this is something that was initially swept under the carpet because it was very embarrassing. The Aryas are supposed to have migrated from Central Asia, which is of course landlocked, and then they enter the plains of the Indus and Saraswati. It's a long time before they are going to be in touch with the ocean, the Arabian Sea, long enough for it to be absorbed into their culture. Yet they talk of ships, they talk of an eastern and western sea, they talk of sailing, storms, waves, and the oceanic imagery is very strong, in fact, in the Rig Veda. So this is already an incompatibility with the migration theory. So the theory, the geography of the Rig Veda is basically this Sapta Sindhava. And Sapta Sindhava is not defined, but then the rivers are constantly named elsewhere. So the scholars have put it together, and the consensus, 1 or 2 disagree, but the consensus is that those Sapta Sindhava are the Indus itself, which is Sindhu. But then Sindhu, you see, words are always fluid in Vedic times, and names are fluid. So Sindhu is that river, but because it is a mighty river, it can be applied often to any river. And it can also be applied to sometimes even a large body of water, because it is so large. So we have to be very careful in the Vedic context, to try to correlate any conclusion we want to reach with all appearances of this particular word or phrase or designation. So, but then it has 5 tributaries, so that's 6, and then there is the Saraswati. Saraswati is mentioned about 72 times in the Rig Veda, either as a goddess. In Rig Veda, she is the goddess of inspiration. She is prayed to for inspiration. In Yajur Veda, which is a little later, she becomes the goddess of speech, Vaj. And of course, you know her future evolution as goddess of knowledge, arts, education, and so on. And but then she is also invoked as a river, and she is a mighty river, Mahoarna Saraswati. She flows from the mountain to the sea, Giribhya Asamudrat, and her flow is unbroken. These are the descriptions we get. And of course, there are also hymns where she is both river and goddess. Interestingly, Saraswati in Rig Veda is the only river to be deified, to be turned into a goddess. And it's also the only river that disappears, because where is the Saraswati? That is the question which the scholars immediately asked. You see, you have a hymn like this one, which is the Nadistuti Sukta, the hymn in praise of rivers. And there are 19 rivers which are named there. So we have a rare, geographical description, because Rigveda doesn't care much about geography or history. It is not interesting in telling us, the historical or social or geographical background. This happens only by the way. And then we have you can see the hymn either in Sanskrit or in English. And first of all, the very striking thing about this hymn is that it starts from the Ganges and it travels westward. Yamuna, Saraswati will come back to her, Sutudri, which is Satlaj, Parushni, etc., Ashikni, which is Chenab. How do we know these identifications? Very simple, because of the Greek names. The Greeks at the time of Alexander the Great visited India and gave names in Greece like Asiknes and so on, which were still close to the Vedic names. And they describe the geography so well that there is no ambiguity. So we end up with Sindhu here. Kubaya is the Kabul River. The Gomatim is the Gumal River. And Kurumum is the Kurum River, which are 3 Afghan tributaries of the Indus. So this is the geography of the Rigveda from Ganga to the Afghan rivers. First of all, why should the rivers be listed? And this is nothing but a pictorial depiction of the what I have just shown you. In fact, this mantra is remarkable because the rishi, whoever wrote it, composed it, had in his mind's eye, if I may say so, had the entire geography of the Northwest. And in two mantras, very briefly, it sweeps through the entire Northwest. So that is remarkable. But why should that be done from east to west? If the Aryans had come from west through the Khyber Pass, this is a general assumption, or whatever pass, they have come from west to east. This is very strange, and there's no explanation. The second point, of course, is the Saraswati. And scholars who, like Max Muller and others, started translated the Rig Veda immediately asked that question because they were not aware of any such river on the map. Actually, it was already there on the map. This is a map from 1760, that the earliest I found, a British map where you see here Sursuti, which is a small stream that still exists in Haryana and as a tributary of the Ghaggar, which is here written as Gugur or something. And so this was noted, and then there were topographic surveys in the early 19th century by British officials who left very detailed records, and they actually made this quite clear that there is the Saraswati river here, and there is a huge, fairly large, especially beyond this map, crossing Haryana, which I spoke of the other day, the Ghaggar, which is today a seasonal river because much of its waters are diverted to irrigation. Nevertheless, during strong monsoons, it still flows into Punjab. And the first person in 1855 who proposed, who put 2 and 2 plus 2 together, and who said that, well, we have a big dry bed here between the Yamuna and the Satluj, which is where Rig Veda tells us that Saraswati is located, and therefore this must be the relic of the Saraswati. This person was Louis Vivien de Saint-Martin, French, very eminent in his days, a French geographer, who therefore proposed, and this was immediately accepted by, so this is a map incidentally by Alexander Cunningham, the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, who wrote a very detailed book of ancient Indian geography. And this became the consensus. So you see 1881, this is a French book where you identity between the Saraswati and the Ghaggar. Then you have a more detailed study in 83 by C.F. Oldham You cannot read perhaps, but there is old Saraswati written here. This is the Ghaggar, and you see how this continues. This is the Hakra. The name changes to Hakra in what is today Pakistan, and the bed goes on till up to the Run of Kutch, the great Run of Kutch. So this was the consensus. In fact, there was no dispute. And Louis Renou, another great French Indologist who did a lot of work on the Vedas, publishes this map. But this map corresponds to Mahabharata times, according to the geographic evidence in Mahabharata. And here, Mahabharata, as I mentioned the other day, mentions that the Saraswati disappears in the sand. It is not the earliest text. There are earlier texts that do so, but I can't give all the details. At a point called Vinashana, of course, you understand what Vinashana means. And there is Saraswati, there is Drishadvati. And this is and in fact, the whole of the Mahabharata, the war itself, takes place in the region of Kurukshetra, of the Saraswati. So we have a literary continuity pointing to the loss of the river, and only here, there is no notion of Saraswati at Allahabad in those days. And this is what scholars have studied. This is a German geographer in 1969, Herbert Wilhelmi, who actually tried to recreate all the phases of the Saraswati from Vedic times, when actually the Sutlej, instead of veering as it does today at Rupa, today it turns here, and this is today the Sutlej. But he makes it flow into the Saraswati, and similarly he makes it flow into the Saraswati, and it is assumed that some tectonic uplift drove away those two contributions from Sutlej and Yamuna and depleted the main sources of the Saraswati, which was then left with only those streams flowing down from the Shivalik hills, including the Ghaggar. So whatever the exact mechanism, we have also now remote sensing studies. This is one of the earliest ones. You see the bed here named Saraswati. This is by ISRO, and getting lost in what is today the Cholistan desert of Pakistan. We have, of course, better images today. You can actually get better images right on your desktop, showing us the bed. And you see here, of course, the Ganga, and I'm sorry, this is Ganga and this is Yamuna. The Sutlej now is here. So why is this bed so marked? Actually, it's an important point. It's not that there is a deep valley. There is no deep valley. There is a slight depression. But there is an underground reserve of water still there. And this water has been dated by isotopes, and it is quite compatible with a few millennium BC. In fact, there is no modern recharge in this region. And especially the dating has taken place here in this part of western Rajasthan, northwestern Rajasthan. And what happens is that this underground reserve of water creates a different vegetation pattern on the surface. And you can, in fact, it was noted by the British officials in the 19th century because they were considering using this route to march into Sindh and conquer Sindh. They abandoned the project because they were able to conquer Punjab first, and then from Punjab they moved into Sindh. This happened in the 1840s. But they were considering using this route because they said that the advantage of this dry bed is that there are lots of wells along the coast, and all those wells have sweet water, fresh water. Whereas if you move a few kilometers away, the wells have brackish water. This was noted in the 19th century reports, and this has been verified by the Rajasthan Water Board in particular. So this different vegetation pattern is what you see. More studies, I mean, this could go on and on, showing the paleo beds linking the Yamuna system with the Saraswati system and the Sutlej system with and in fact this is still sometimes a seasonal stream. It is called the Patyavali, I think, or the Hind river. So plenty of evidences. The last is the recent ISRO study showing the various causes of the Sarasvati because it has shifted its bed several times, like all the Indo-Gangetic rivers do. As you know, those plains are very flat, so any accumulation of alluvium or any tectonic change will cause those rivers to change course. This happens even today in the Ganges plains, as you know. So it comes all the way to the Run of Kutch, which you see here. And this is, as a reminder, the site of Dholavira, which we visited the other day. So in any case, we have, and the reason I show all these names, I'm not going to read them out, is because there is a false impression created both in the media and by a certain class of historians who object to the identification between the Ghaggar and the Sarasvati, that those who promote these identification are basically Hindutva people. And this is written verbatim in articles after articles, and that those who say that this was a Sarasvati are basically Hindutva. Well, kindly decide whether all these scholars, and in my book you will have detailed references of their writings, whether they can all be Hindutva, I doubt, but this is the consensus that this is the only possible candidate for the river that will match the description of the Rig Veda, which is very simple, that the river lies between Yamuna and Satluj. So this is of course a strong argument against the Aryan Invasion Theory, because we have seen that the river dries up around 1900 BC. This is what actually I'm going to show it now, and this is the whole question of the end of the Indus civilization. Previously in the old books, I'll show you another example now, the mechanism invoked was invasions, and this civilization was supposed to have fallen to invasions. It was a kind of a repetition of the story of the Roman Empire that falls to invasions by barbarian tribes. So naturally scholars were tempted to invoke similar mechanisms. Social unrest is also spoken of, but we don't have any very firm evidence for that. Great drought in 2200 BC, I'm coming to that. Drying up of the Sarasvati, you will see in the next slide. Ecological degradation is a very interesting theory that Harappans overuse their resources, especially their forests, for all their industries, their pottery, metal, seal, bead industries, and that might have precipitated geographical overstretch. Maybe the civilization was over just too large a region, 1 million square kilometers, and the state structure that maintained it had to collapse at a certain point. This is also an interesting discussion. Finally, economic collapse. The end of the trade with the Mesopotamians is recorded in Mesopotamian tablets. After 1900 BC, Meluhha totally disappears and is never spoken of again. So something happens. Now, is it a cause or is it a consequence? In fact, for all of these, this is the discussion. We may say that they are all factors in the end, but which one is exactly the cause is not very easy to determine. But there is a growing trend among scholars to prefer this, a pattern of ecological factors. This is 2000 BC, 4000 year before present. And you can see here from different regions. This is Northeast India, this is Oman, this is, where is this? I forget. I forget. This is, of course, Japan, Italy, Tibetan Plateau. And you find that there is a sudden drop in precipitation. There is actually a worldwide drought lasting for something like 200 years. And of course it would, and in fact in Mesopotamia, one particular kingdom fell because of it. This is now accepted. So whether this could be the cause of the end of the Indus civilization, possible, at least it would have been a factor, important factor. But then, see what happens in the Sarasvati basin when you move from the early Harappan phase, before the urban phase, to the urban phase here, and the late Harappan phase, after the collapse of the urban order. So here you have a continuity of sites in the Sarasvati region. Then during the mature phase, one small break appears here at what is actually the international border here today. And finally, a dramatic change after 1900 BC, where all the central part of the Sarasvati basin is abandoned. Sites like Kalibangan is here. Kalibangan actually is here. Disappears. People just go. So the assumption is that the Saraswati ceased to flow. And of course, if the Saraswati, and this has been confirmed, these are my own maps, but I can show you many studies like this one from International Team of Geologists, which appeared recently, which shows this is a mature phase, you have almost perfect continuity, and then after 1900, suddenly all the central part,
it's here.
all the central part is abandoned. So obviously, if this is the case, then the Saraswati dried up 1900 BC, but then the Aryans who composed the hymns on the banks of the Saraswati and praised the river as flowing unbroken all the way to the sea, they cannot have done that in 1500 BC. There's no Saraswati left in 1500 BC. So this, in fact, is the reason why some people stood up when this fact became clear. In 1984, to be precise, all the data was correlated, and it was shown that Saraswati in full flow meant 3rd millennium BC, not 2nd, 3rd or even beyond. And then some people stood up and said, well, in that case, it cannot be the Saraswati. So, well, fine, this is, everybody has a right to his opinion, but then the natural, logical consequence is that those who composed the Vedic hymns praising the Saraswati in full flow did so before it dried up, and that would be in the 3rd millennium BC or beyond. So this also is a strong argument against the migration theory. Now, as far as the archaeological evidence is concerned, we must mention, because it is still in our textbooks, you see 1947, this is about the kind of evidence we use in our textbooks today in India. Though NCERT textbooks have improved, I must say, but in state boards of education, people just copy, from the previous writer. They don't realize that history textbooks need to be updated regularly. So we had a great archaeologist called Mortimer Wheeler, who was sent in 1944 to India from the war front to salvage the Archaeological Survey of India, which was in a pretty bad shape. And he did a fantastic job. He woke up, he was extremely energetic, woke up the whole sleeping survey, slumbering as he says, and introduced very modern methods of stratigraphy, rigorous stratigraphy in excavations, which permitted a much better control of chronologies at sites that was not followed before him. And also, to his great credit, trained generations of Indian archaeologists through various schools and training camps in the field. But then he had also his pet theories. And when these skeletons were found in the streets of Mohenjo-daro, this is at Mohenjo-daro, 33 of them, later on 37 of them, then his imagination started working. And he said, well, this is the evidence of the final massacre, as he called it, of Mohenjo-daro. And he said, who could be the authors? Obviously, it has to be the Aryans, because don't forget that Indra is the Purandara, he's the destroyer of the cities. If you take Pur to mean city, which is another big issue, but I can't go into it today. And therefore he said Indra, the leader of the Aryans, the Aryas rather, stands accused. And this had a terrific effect, of course, and people tended to be convinced because he was a very persuasive person. But an American archaeologist in 1964, George Dales, studied those skeletons more closely. He was skeptical, and he found that they actually did not belong to the same epochs. One S is missing at epoch. They were from different periods of time. So first of all, that is a big question mark. And they were, to his understanding, his interpretation, they were the result not of a massacre, but of a sloppy burial. And he asked, where are the burnt fortresses, the arrowheads, weapons, pieces of armor, the smashed chariots and bodies of the invaders and defenders? And there is absolutely no evidence of any kind that he was asking. So he called it a mythical massacre. In the 1980s, another American, Kenneth Kennedy, who actually sadly passed away just a few months ago, a brilliant bioanthropologist, I'm going to come back to him in a few minutes, studied the skeletons now much more closely, because bioanthropology, that was his job, you know, to take the bones and try to find evidence of what happened, or evidences of disease, or all kinds of evidences. And he found that many of the injuries which Mortimer Wheeler had pointed to, the bones had apparently marks of injuries, had actually healed before the death of the person. And many of them were not injuries at all, but were just the result of post-mortem erosion. So then of course, the whole theory was discarded, and Wheeler accepted that he had promoted this theory. He said, what exactly was his quote? He said, in a lighter vein. But still he preferred to stick to it nevertheless. Even in the last edition of this book, though he acknowledged that there were weaknesses, he said still that's the best we can do. But ultimately, what archaeology tells us is that there is no evidence of invaders, and you know, especially in terms of artifacts. You would expect invaders to have left weapons, to have left different types of tools, of objects of daily use. Archaeologists are excellent at documenting all these material objects. There is no intrusive culture, as they say, towards the end of the Harappan civilization. So I'm going to skip some of these quotations to save a little time. But I can just say that there is unanimity among the archaeologists to say that there is absolutely no such evidence. And also, there is now an accepted time gap between the end of the Indus civilization and the... so what people like Wheeler did to close this time gap is to say that the Indus civilization continued till 1700 BC, and the Aryans actually might have invaded at that time earlier than thought. Of course, you can always play with dates, but this is a posteriori improvement. It's not just within the... actually, the problem is very complex, because if you want the Aryans to have come in, first of all, they would have crossed somewhere. Either they originate somewhere here in Central Asia, or if, as many scholars propose, they originate in Anatolia, or in the Black Sea, which would be somewhere here, or in southern Russia, which would be somewhere here, there is actually no consensus even today where the Proto-Indo-Europeans, as they are called, originated from. In any case, they would have crossed all these regions, and there are certain cultures which are found in these regions. This is, for example, the Bactria-Mahajana archaeological complex, a brilliant civilization of the Bronze Age, of the contemporary with the Harappan civilization. And then you have post-Harappan, you have the Gandhara grave culture in Swat, you have the cemetery age culture in parts of the Indus Valley, you have the copper board culture, this is in the 2nd millennium BC, and then later on the painted grey culture. And what I can say in brief is simple, that there have been scholars to promote all of these as being Aryan culture. But then it's you cannot have all of them. You have to choose. And the problem is that none of them actually covers the whole ground. You see, none of them covers the whole journey that the Harappans would have followed. Cemetery age has been promoted for a long time as being evidence. It is visible. It was first visible at Harappa, at a place, a cemetery, in fact, called Cemetery Age. And it was thought to be the result of the incoming Aryans, but then later on, and this is what has happened with most of these cultures, it was shown to be in continuity with the final stages of the urban culture. So there is actually no cultural break, and this is what we see for all of these cultures. And none of them actually provides a good explanation for an invading people. So then I have to spend a few minutes on the horse issue, because there is an argument which is presented, and it has to be dealt with both textually and archaeologically, which is, and you remember our first little textbooks, that the Aryans introduced basically the horse in the subcontinent. it is a fact that Rig Veda constantly speaks of Ashwa, horse-drawn chariots, and therefore some scholars will say that the horse is central to Vedic culture. And then they say further that there are no horse remains in the Indus cities and no horse depictions in Indus art. Therefore, Harappan civilization cannot reflect a Vedic culture, and the Vedic age is post-Harappan. Now, seen like that, the argument seems to be very strong, but it has many flaws. First of all, it is not true that no horse remains have been found in the Harappan civilization. 12 Harappan sites have come up with bones or teeth identified by the best archaeozoologists, as they are called, many of them Indian, and I must say at this point that there was a bit of bias against Indian archaeozoologists. They were not taken seriously, and they were said to confuse the horse bones with the bones of the wild ass. And it is true that the wild ass has bones which are similar to the horse bones, but then the Indian archaeozoologists were all the time, like A.K. Sharma for instance, were all the time claiming that they could distinguish between the two. So here, for instance, we have at Surkotada, which is a site in Gujarat, during the mature phase, we have bones which have been identified by this A.K. Sharma as bones of the horse, the true horse. And initially, it was just ignored. But then it so happens that one day, an international expert, the late Hungarian archaeozoologist Sander Bököny, visited India and saw the bones at the archaeological survey in Delhi. And he studied them, and he said this is not only the true horse, this is a domesticated true horse, because some teeth had marks which can be done only by a horse bit, the biting of a horse bit. So this triggered now that we had a non-Indian asserting that the horse was present at Surkotada. People stood up and took notice. And it triggered a fierce debate, and some scholars like Richard Meadow, who is a fine US archaeologist but determined not to find any horse remains at all in the Indus civilization, wrote a very lengthy paper where he tortured the evidence and said that no, this is the wild ass. Now he kindly invited Sander Bököny to give a reply, which he did, and the argument was extremely detailed, and Sander Bököny stuck to his opinion that this was not the wild ass but the domesticated horse. Richard Meadow gave a second rejoinder. By the time Bököny could give his final, actually he had passed away unfortunately. So the debate died, and now you have historians claiming that this has been proved to be the wild ass. But the funny part is that when people try to trace migrations of Indo-Europeans through Europe, and they follow the evolution of the horse, supposedly again, brought into Europe by the same Proto-Indo-Europeans, who do they refer to? To Sander Bököny. This is the final authority always quoted, and I've given in some papers many references that he is always quoted as the supreme authority. So he is accepted in Europe, but he is not accepted back home. So this is a little unfair in my opinion. And therefore, we cannot say that the horse did not exist in the Harappan civilization. In fact, the same Mortimer Wheeler, whom I showed you, and who, as you saw, was a great defender of the Aryan Invasion Theory, acknowledged that there were bones of a horse at Mohenjo-daro, though a higher level, but the levels were unfortunately not dated, so we cannot offer a firm date. But from Ranagundai, which is in Balochistan, earliest and doubtless pre-Harappan layers. So this much he accepted even in his days, 1968. And he said it is likely enough that camel, horse, and ass were in fact all a familiar feature of the Indus caravan. So you see that some very orthodox scholars do not have a problem accepting that the horse exists. Do we have no depictions? Well, this is again debated. You have to decide whether this found in Lothal, this figurine found in Lothal in Gujarat, does it represent a horse or a dog or something else? The tail is bushy, which is why Dr. S.R. Rao The late archaeologists who excavated there identified it as a horse. But I agree that it is open to debate. However, this one in Mohenjo-daro, identified by Ernest Mackay in the 1930s as a horse, does look like a horse, especially with the elongated neck. And well, this is about all we have. There are a few more, but they are pretty indistinct. And it is true that the Harappans did not clearly depict the horse, for example, on seals, on pottery. There is no such depiction. But if you do not depict an animal, it doesn't prove that it doesn't exist. They do not depict the cow, ever. Yet they were bulls. We know that they depicted the bull, and they were, bull horses, so there must have been cows. Camel horses, camel bones have been found, quite a few, but the animal is never depicted. The cat, the wolf, the lion, the jackal are never depicted, yet they existed in the Harappan environment. So we cannot take non-depiction as a proof in itself. If bones have been found, that should be enough. Furthermore, lots of points which I will have to mention very briefly, but they are very important because they show how we can, treat an argument in the wrong way. We can have a wrong methodology. People say the Aryans brought the horse. Therefore, we should expect an increase in horse bone remains and depictions after 1500 BC. Do we have? Answer is no. There is absolutely no increase in horse bone remains after 1500 BC or depictions. In fact, the horse is never depicted in India, almost. There are a few sites which do give a few horse figurines. But in a big way, it's only in the Mauryan Empire that the horse suddenly is a glorified animal. Previous to that, it's only the bull, the elephant, basically. In the Rig Veda, and this is the biggest secret of the horse argument, which nobody debates, and I stumbled upon it one day while going through carefully to all the passages in the Rig Veda that mention the horse. In fact, it is not just the Aryas that have Ashwa, it is also the Dasyus. The adversaries of the Aryas also have horses, and I can give you at least 8 passages to prove that. So if Ashwa means the horse, then it is as well a non-Vedic animal. It is also with non-Vedic populations. Then the whole argument that the horse should be a marker of Vedic culture, which is what many scholars insist upon, falls flat. So you see that the argument is not... I'll give just briefly one example, which is that Ushas, to show the complexity of interpreting the Rig Veda, Ushas, the dawn, is praised in one hymn as Gomati Ashwavati. Now, if you look at the 19th century translators, British translators, they translate Gomati is full of cows and Ashwavati is full of horses. So this is dawn. But Go is accepted also as being light. You see, cow, milk, light. So Go, and any standard dictionary in Sanskrit, Go is also the light. That is well accepted. But what Sri Aurobindo said in 1915, before the discovery of the Indus civilization, is that Ashwa does not mean actually the physical animal, it means speed and energy, not always the animal. In that case, his translation is dawn full of light and energy. Now you kindly decide which of the two you want, but this shows you the difficulty, the risk in mechanically interpreting terms of the Rig Veda. Now I'm going to very quickly mention, I'll take 5 minutes to close this lecture. It's a huge topic. I knew I would be running behind times, but it doesn't matter. We have important, I'll just summarize. I'm not going to read all this. I'll just summarize. Very important skeleton studies taking place since the 1990s. The issue is very simple. Can we identify through skeleton studies a different human type? Suddenly, suppose South Americans had entered, or Chinese people had entered India in the 2nd millennium BC, you would be able to detect it because there would be different physical features. And the big answer is no. Kenneth Kennedy the same, and many of his colleagues, and Indian colleagues also, all studied hundreds of skeletons belonging to the Harappan civilization and belonging to the later phases. And they said there is essentially no difference. And what we see, they said, is that there is biological continuity, which means that the Harappans were basically the ancestors of today's Gujaratis, today's Rajasthanis, today's Punjabis, today's Sindhis. They were themselves of different physical types. This is not as if the Harappans were a tightly homogeneous population. But they fail to see, and that is why Kennedy, for example, in many of his papers, has emphatically rejected the Aryan Invasion Theory. I'm going to have to skip the genetic evidence, but I can simply mention that we have now, since the last 15, 20 years, yes, there is a burn smell, so please look around, and in case you detect anything, it could be a Vedic fire somewhere, but the genetic evidence is that things are very complicated, and when we plot I will skip the rest, when we plot the genetic evidence and the DNA of many populations, we would expect Brahmins, to be, or Punjabis who are on the path of the supposed Aryans, to be very close to Central Asia. In fact, we find Gujaratis and Chenchus, which are the Dravidian tribe of Andhra Pradesh, among the closest. So there is something wrong, and the genetic evidence is this. No, it is not wrong. It is not wrong. Oh. So I can't read all this, but there are a few. Let me jump to the conclusion of the genetic studies, because they are so important. Number one, they do not accept, geneticists today do not accept the concept of Adivasi. They say we cannot determine which is the earliest population in India. So this concept, which is colonial, I mean, it was the British government which set it up, has no scientific definition. Secondly, surprisingly, there is not much genetic difference between tribes, low caste and high caste. In fact, the genetic evidence clusters geographically. A Brahmin of South India is closer genetically to South Indian tribes than to a Brahmin of North India. So these are the findings, and anyone interested, please mail me. I have a whole paper on this with lots and lots of references to recent papers, at least 20 recent papers of genetic studies. So therefore, the concept of an Aryan race or a Dravidian race is, in fact, the very concept of race today, if you ask a biologist, cannot be defined scientifically. South Indians also did not, according to genetic evidence, are long settled. It is not as if the Dravidians, who are supposed to have been also invading from the Mediterranean, according to some models, are also long settled in India. In fact, all major populations, except some fringe populations, especially in the northeast, we do know that some tribal communities migrated from Burma, from China, but otherwise all populations are said to be settled in India for at least 40,000 years. So therefore, Adivasi loses all its meaning. In fact, a number of studies, you can see the names at the bottom, now propose that humanity came first out of Africa into northwest of the subcontinent, and from there went into all other parts of the world. In that case, except for Africans, all humans would have ancestors in northwest India. These are some of the current theories. It is still, the genetics is a very fresh field, but this is what it is. Now, just 1 minute and I will close, to show that the archaeological evidence also does not agree that there is a cultural gap or break between Harappan, supposedly pre-Vedic, and Gangetic, supposedly Vedic. You just see certain things like this Harappan swastika. Fire altars have been found at several sites and can have no other explanation. For example, at Banawali, 1 foot thick of ash was found in this structure, which cannot serve any other purpose, obviously. So fire worship, this is from Kalibangan, a row of 7 fire altars. This is in Gujarat. And worship of Linga and Trishul, which evoke worship of Shiva, and Shiva is a Vedic god. He appears with his full name in the Yajurveda. In Rigveda, he is only as Rudra. Then various characters seated in yogic postures with 3 faces. This gives us a context which is something is familiar to us in this. Even the Harappan unicorn, the concept of a bull with a sharp horn or sharpened horn exists in the Rig Veda and in Mahabharata, where Krishna says that Ekashringa was his former old name. So we have such bridges which need further study and can be interpreted in many ways, but also the evidence of yoga. You recognize here from Harappan figurines some well-known posture, possible practice of meditation. This important figure is shown in deep contemplation. So these point to a certain cultural continuum, which at least all these scholars have stressed, even from John Marshall in 1931, stressed the fact that actually there is no break. There is no significant break or hiatus between Indus and Ganges phase. And the previous concept of a dark age in the 2nd millennium BC, this is found still in many textbooks, is no longer valid, says US archaeologist James Schaffer. So the cities disappear, but the culture lives on. And through what mechanism, I will try to explain in my next talk on the Ganges civilization. So the conclusions, the Aryans remain elusive. They are so elusive that, and maybe that is the best tribute we can give them, that archaeologists have completely stopped talking about the Aryans. In the archaeological literature of the past 15 or 20 years, archaeologists just don't want to hear about Aryans anymore. They can explain the whole evolution of cultures in the subcontinent without invoking Aryans or anybody else. So therefore, but then, since we have no physical, bioanthropological or genetic evidence for them, some scholars have proposed that, okay, they did not invade brutally, they migrated, and since there is no evidence for physical evidence, they migrated in very, very small numbers. And one scholar, a famous linguist, Michael Witzer, even said that one Afghan tribe overstaying in India would have been enough. So you kindly decide if it is enough. He calls it the trickle-in theory. So we don't have an invasion, we don't even have a migration, we have a trickling in of Aryans. But whether this can be rationally justified to explain that these trickled in people could have overturned the entire linguistic, cultural, social landscape of India, that is the big issue. Well, it remains mainstream, especially because of linguistic support, but my point is that why continue to teach this divisive theory, which has been increasingly challenged and carries such a heavy colonial baggage. So I'm sorry I exceeded the time a little bit, but this is a huge topic and I did my best to show you that